Ladies and gentlemen, I've exhausted all options. I don't know how to save this airplane. When the captain's voice cracked with defeat at 35,000 feet, passengers prepared to die. Then a 14-year-old girl stood up from seat 12C, put down her phone, and said 5 words that changed everything.
I can fly this plane.
I know how to fly. Before you dive into this story, tell me, which country are you from? Comment below. Subscribe now because tomorrow I'm dropping the best story yet. You don't want to miss it. The Boeing 737 sliced through the morning sky at 35,000 feet, carrying 147 passengers from Chicago to Seattle. Most travelers were absorbed in their devices, books, or conversations, paying little attention to the 14-year-old girl sitting in seat 12C. Emma Richardson looked like any typical teenager traveling alone, her dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, wearing an oversized hoodie and jeans, white earbuds dangling from her phone as she scrolled through what appeared to be social media on the small screen. Flight attendant Karen Martinez paused by Emma's seat during the beverage service, speaking in that gentle, slightly louder tone adults often use with teenagers. "Hey sweetie, what can I get you to drink? Apple juice? Sprite?" she asked with a warm smile, treating Emma like the child she appeared to be. "Just water, thanks," Emma replied without looking up from her phone, playing the part perfectly. The businessman in 12B glanced over with mild annoyance at yet another teenager glued to their device, probably watching TikTok videos or texting friends, he assumed. The elderly woman in 12A smiled sympathetically, remembering her own grandchildren and their constant phone usage. What none of them knew was that Emma wasn't scrolling through Instagram or Snapchat. On her screen was a detailed cockpit schematic of a Boeing 737-800, the exact model they were flying on. She was reviewing hydraulic system redundancies and emergency electrical procedures, continuing the obsessive study that had consumed her life for the past 3 years. Her father, Captain James Richardson, had been a commercial airline pilot for 22 years before a heart condition forced his early retirement. Unable to fly anymore, he had poured all his knowledge into his daughter, teaching her everything from basic aerodynamics to advanced emergency procedures that most pilots never encountered in their entire careers. Emma's bedroom at home looked nothing like a typical teenage girl's room. Instead of boy band posters, her walls displayed aviation charts, approach plates and emergency procedure flowcharts. Her computer ran professional-grade flight simulation software, not games, where she had logged over 2,000 hours practicing everything from routine flights to catastrophic emergencies. She had studied every major aviation disaster of the last 50 years, analyzing what went wrong, what the pilots did right, and what they could have done differently. She knew the Air France 447 accident investigation report by heart, understood the unique challenges of the Gimli glider hydraulic failure, and had memorized the emergency descent procedures for rapid decompression scenarios. Her father had been unconventional in his teaching methods. He would say during their evening sessions in his home flight simulator, "The book tells you what to do when one thing goes wrong. I'm teaching you what to do when everything goes wrong at once." He would create scenarios that combined multiple failures, situations so dire that they seemed impossible. Dual engine failure with hydraulic loss. Fire in the cargo hold with electrical system damage. Severe structural failure with navigation system corruption. He made her think beyond the checklist, to understand the aircraft so intimately that she could find solutions in the gray areas where standard procedures ended. But sitting in seat 12C, Emma was just another teenager to everyone around her. When she got up to use the restroom, passengers barely noticed. When she returned, the businessman in 12B had to stand to let her pass, sighing with obvious impatience as she mumbled a quick apology. Nobody suspected that behind those young eyes was an aviation knowledge that rivaled many commercial pilots, gained through thousands of hours of unconventional but intensive education. The flight had been smooth for the first 90 minutes. Captain David Morrison and First Officer Sarah Chen were flying the aircraft with the routine professionalism of experienced pilots. Morrison had over 15,000 flight hours, Chen had 7,000. They chatted casually about their families, the weather in Seattle, and their upcoming schedules, everything normal and unremarkable as the autopilot guided them westward across the country. Then, at exactly 10:47 a.m., everything changed. The first indication was subtle, a slight vibration that Captain Morrison felt through the yoke. He frowned, exchanged a glance with Chen, and they both scanned their instruments. Before either could speak, a master caution light illuminated, followed immediately by multiple warning alerts. The engine number 2 fire warning blared to life, its urgent sound filling the cockpit. "Engine fire number 2. Chen called out, her hands already moving through the memorized procedure. Morrison pulled back the throttle for engine 2 and reached for the fire suppression handle. But as he pulled it, rotating it to discharge the first fire bottle, the warnings multiplied. Hydraulic system A pressure dropped to 0. Then hydraulic system B fluctuated wildly. Electrical buses began showing faults. What the hell? Morrison muttered, his practiced calm beginning to crack. This wasn't one emergency, it was cascading failures across multiple systems. The kind of scenario that showed up in worst-case training sessions but wasn't supposed to happen in real life. The aircraft shuddered violently. In the cabin, passengers gasped as their drinks spilled and overhead bins popped open. Emma's water bottle flew from her tray table, but she barely noticed. Her mind was already racing, categorizing the sounds and movements of the aircraft, her trained ear detecting abnormalities that other passengers couldn't identify. In the cockpit, Captain Morrison and First Officer Chen were facing a nightmare. The fire in Engine 2 hadn't suppressed. Hydraulic System C had now joined A and B in failure, which should have been impossible. They were independent systems. The flight control computers were showing degraded modes. Warning messages cascaded across their displays faster than they could read them. "We're losing everything," Chen said, her voice tight with stress as she worked through emergency checklists at a frantic pace. "This doesn't make sense, David. These systems shouldn't be failing together." Morrison was on the radio with dispatch, trying to explain a situation he himself didn't fully understand. "We have multiple system failures, requesting immediate vectors to nearest suitable airport." But even as he said it, he felt the aircraft's controls becoming mushy, unresponsive. The fly-by-wire system was degrading. Another violent shudder ran through the airframe, stronger this time. A sound like tearing metal echoed through the fuselage. Passengers screamed. The oxygen masks deployed with a loud whoosh, dangling in front of terrified faces. Emma grabbed her mask and secured it properly, her hand steady despite her racing heart, exactly as her father had taught her. Around her, people fumbled with their masks, some putting them on incorrectly in their panic. "We've got structural damage," Morrison shouted over the cacophony of alarms. His instruments showed the vertical stabilizer had sustained damage, possibly from an uncontained engine failure that sent debris into the tail section. The rudder controls were barely responding. "Sarah, I can't hold her steady. The trim isn't responding." Chen was pale, her fingers flying across controls that were becoming increasingly useless. "Hydraulics are gone across all systems. We're down to electrical backup only, and that's failing too. David, we have no redundancy left. If we lose electrical, we lose everything." In the cabin, chaos reigned. People were crying, praying, holding hands with strangers. Flight attendants tried to maintain order, but fear was contagious. Karen Martinez gripped a seat back, her professional training warring with her own terror as she felt the aircraft bucking and shaking beneath her feet. Emma sat quietly in her seat, her mind working through the symptoms like her father had trained her. Engine fire spreading to multiple hydraulic systems suggested a catastrophic failure in the engine that sent shrapnel through the tail cone where hydraulic lines ran. The electrical failures indicated damage to the auxiliary power systems in the tail as well. The structural damage to the vertical stabilizer explained the control issues. She was building a mental picture of the aircraft's condition, and it was dire. Captain Morrison's voice came over the intercom, and what he said next would haunt everyone who heard it. His voice was shaking, the professional veneer stripped away by overwhelming crisis. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain. I need to be honest with you. We have suffered catastrophic failures across multiple critical systems. First Officer Chen and I have exhausted all our emergency procedures. We are losing control of the aircraft, and we cannot find a way to stabilize it." There was a pause, filled only by the sounds of crying passengers and screaming alarms. "I'm sorry. We have done everything we know how to do, and it's not enough. I don't know how to save this airplane." The words hit the cabin like a physical blow. A commercial airline captain, the ultimate authority figure in the sky, was giving up. Both pilots, with their combined 22,000 hours of experience, were admitting defeat. The sobbing intensified. Some passengers became hysterical. Others sat in stunned silence, unable to process that their lives were about to end. Emma unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. Her legs felt shaky, but her mind was clear. She had a choice to make: stay silent and die with everyone else, or reveal what she knew and face the overwhelming skepticism that would come from adults in crisis being told a 14-year-old might have answers. "Sit down, honey," Karen Martinez said as Emma stepped into the aisle, the flight attendant's voice cracking with stress. "You need to stay in your seat and keep your mask on. I need to get to the cockpit, Emma said, her young voice steady and clear. I can help. Karen stared at her like she'd lost her mind. Sweetheart, I know you're scared, but you need to sit down. The pilots are doing everything they can. They're not, Emma said louder now. They're giving up. And I know things they don't. She started moving toward the front of the cabin. The businessman from 12B grabbed her arm. Kid, this isn't a game. Sit down before you get hurt. His grip was firm, his face a mix of fear and anger. Emma pulled her arm free with surprising strength, adrenaline giving her courage. My father is Captain James Richardson, retired from United Airlines. He taught me everything. I've studied aviation emergencies for 3 years, thousands of hours in professional simulators. I know what's happening to this plane, and I know procedures they haven't tried yet. The elderly woman from 12A looked at Emma with wide eyes. Let her go, she said suddenly. What do we have to lose? Karen hesitated, looking at this teenager who spoke with such conviction. It was insane. Impossible. A 14-year-old girl couldn't possibly help where experienced pilots had failed. But the captain had said they were out of options. What did they have to lose? Come with me, Karen said, making a decision that defied all logic but was born of desperate hope. They pushed toward the cockpit door, Emma moving with purpose while other passengers watched in confusion and disbelief. Karen knocked hard on the reinforced cockpit door. Captain Morrison, I have a passenger who says she can help. Not now, came the shouted reply. The aircraft dropped suddenly, making everyone in the cabin scream. Emma braced herself against the wall. She's a pilot's daughter. She's been trained. Please. Karen was shouting now, her own desperation bleeding through. There was a pause. The door lock clicked. First Officer Chin opened it slightly, her face streaked with sweat, eyes wild with stress. This isn't a joke, we don't have time. I know you've lost all 3 hydraulic systems, Emma said quickly, her voice cutting through the chaos. The fire in engine 2 sent debris into the tail cone, severing the hydraulic lines. You've probably got damage to the auxiliary hydraulic pump and the electrical generators back there too. Your fly-by-wire is degrading to direct mode, but your control inputs aren't getting through because the backup electrical system is failing. Am I right? Chen's mouth opened in shock. This was exactly what their instruments were showing, scenarios they were still trying to piece together. How could you possibly? Let me in, Emma said. I've studied the JAL Flight 123 scenario, the United 232 scenario, Qantas 72. This is a combination failure, and there are procedures that aren't in your standard checklist. My dad made me practice situations exactly like this. Captain Morrison turned in his seat, seeing a teenage girl standing in his cockpit doorway while his aircraft was dying around him. Every instinct screamed that this was absurd. But he had just announced to 147 people that he couldn't save them. His standard procedures had failed. His years of experience had hit a wall. And this kid, this impossible kid, was talking about scenarios and flight numbers that only someone with serious aviation knowledge would reference. You've got 30 seconds to tell me something I don't know, Morrison said, his voice hard. Or you go back to your seat. Emma stepped fully into the cockpit, her eyes scanning the instrument panels with a familiarity that shocked both pilots. You've been trying to use your primary flight computers to manage what's left of your controls, but they're programmed to reject inputs that seem abnormal. You need to manually override to alternate mode and use asymmetric thrust to compensate for your rudder loss. Engine 1 only, maximum thrust on turns, idle on opposite turns. It's called the throttle steering technique, but it only works if you completely abandon your rudder inputs and let the computer think you're in a controlled single-engine scenario. Morrison and Chin exchanged glances. What she was describing was a technique that existed in theory, adapted from accidents where pilots had managed to steer severely damaged aircraft using only engine thrust. But it wasn't in any standard procedure manual. It required intimate knowledge of flight dynamics and computer systems. The electrical failure is your critical problem right now, Emma continued, speaking fast. You need to isolate the damaged generators in the tail and run everything off the APU and your remaining engine generator. Shut down all non-essential electrical buses to reduce load. Drop your landing gear manually, it'll create drag and help slow you without using systems you don't have, plus the gear will give you some directional stability, acting like a crude vertical stabilizer. That's insane, Chin said. Manual gear deployment at this altitude and speed will create massive drag forces we can't control. You can't control the aircraft anyway, Emma shot back. The drag will force you into a descent, which you need because you have to get below 10,000 feet to reduce structural stress on your damaged tail. The gear doors will partially act as air brakes. Yes, it's unconventional, but so is your situation. Morrison stared at her. Everything she said was technically sound, terrifying and dangerous, but sound. It was the kind of creative emergency thinking that came from someone who had studied disasters not just to pass tests, but to truly understand the edge cases where normal rules didn't apply. Who the hell are you? Morrison whispered. Someone who spent 3 years preparing for this exact moment, Emma said. My dad made me promise that if I ever found myself in an aviation emergency, I wouldn't stay silent just because I'm young. Please let me help you. The aircraft shuddered again, dropping 200 feet in a sickening lurch. Warning alarm screamed. Morrison made his decision. Chin, make room, he ordered. Kit, sit in the jump seat. Start talking us through this step by step. Emma moved into the tiny cockpit, sitting in the fold-down seat behind the center console. Her heart was hammering, but her father's voice echoed in her mind, calm, steady, methodical. First, electrical isolation. Captain, you need to pull the circuit breakers for the number 2 and 3 generators. They're damaged and causing backfeed that's corrupting your electrical buses. Morrison's hands moved to the overhead panel. These breakers. 2 rows back, labeled Gen 2 and Gen 3, Emma said. Pull them now. He pulled them. Immediately, several warning lights extinguished. The electrical system stabilized slightly. Now configure the APU to carry the primary load, Emma continued. First Officer Chin, APU master switch on, then APU generator online. Chen's hands were shaking as she followed instructions from a teenager, but the procedures were correct. The APU generator came online, providing stable electrical power. More warnings cleared. Okay, now the hard part, Emma said. You need to switch your flight control computers to alternate mode manually. It'll feel wrong because you'll lose a lot of automated protections, but those protections are what's preventing your inputs from working. The computer thinks your control movements are errors because they're outside normal parameters. Morrison found the switches. Switching to alternate mode. The feel of the controls changed immediately, becoming heavier, more direct. I've got response, crude, but I've got response. Good, Emma said. Now, First Officer Chen, you're going to manage thrust. We're going to use Engine 1 to steer. When Captain Morrison wants to turn left, you give maximum thrust on Engine 1. When he wants to turn right, you pull to idle. It's going to be rough and slow, but it's how United 232 managed to steer with no hydraulics. United 232 still crashed, Chin said, her voice tight. Because they didn't have electrical controls and their damage was worse, Emma replied. You have degraded electrical. It's enough. Trust me. Over the next several minutes, Emma talked them through a series of procedures that no checklist contained. They manually dropped the landing gear, and just as she predicted, the massive drag forced them into a descent, but also provided stability. They shut down all non-essential systems to preserve electrical power. They practiced the throttle steering technique, Morrison calling for turns while Chin manipulated the thrust lever, learning the delayed response and oversensitivity of this desperate control method. We need to find an airport, Morrison said. Somewhere with a long runway and emergency equipment. Emma had already thought of this. Denver International is 60 miles southeast. Runway 16 R34L is 16,000 feet long. You'll need every inch of it because you can't use reverse thrust effectively with our control limitations, and your brakes are going to be compromised with hydraulics out. How do you know Denver's closest? Chin asked. I study aviation charts like other kids study Instagram, Emma said. I know every major airport in North America, their runway configurations and their emergency capabilities. Morrison contacted air traffic control, declaring an emergency and requesting vectors to Denver. The controller's voice came back, professional but urgent, clearing all traffic and rolling emergency equipment. The descent was terrifying. Without normal flight controls, every adjustment was an exercise in trial and error. Morrison would nudge the controls, Chin would adjust thrust, and the aircraft would lumber in the desired direction like a wounded giant. Emma sat between them, offering guidance based on scenarios she'd studied, techniques adapted from half a dozen historical accidents. You're coming in too fast, Emma observed as they passed through 15,000 feet. You need to create more drag. Extend your flaps, not full, just 5 degrees. It'll help slow you without creating too much pitch change. Chin extended the flaps incrementally. The airspeed began to drop. Altitude 10,000 feet, Morrison called out. We're lined up with runway 34L, but we're still way too fast and too high. Deploy flight spoilers manually, Emma said. They're hydraulically operated normally, But there's a manual override. Check your overhead panel. Morrison found the manual spoiler lever, something he'd never used in 20 years of flying because it was only for situations where all hydraulics failed. He pulled it. The spoilers raised, disrupting airflow over the wings and creating enormous drag. The aircraft began to slow more rapidly. Gear down is helping, Chin noted. Airspeed decreasing through 220 knots. They were at 5,000 feet now, the Denver airport visible ahead. Emergency vehicles lined the runway, red and white lights flashing. News helicopters circled at a safe distance, broadcasting the attempted landing of a crippled airliner being talked down by a teenage girl, though the passengers and world wouldn't learn that detail until later. I can't get the nose down enough, Morrison said, struggling with the controls. We're going to overshoot the touchdown zone. Use maximum thrust for 3 seconds to pitch the nose down, then cut to idle, Emma said. It's counterintuitive, but the thrust vector on this aircraft is below the center of gravity. A burst of power will actually nose you down before the speed increase lifts you. Morrison hesitated. Everything in his training said adding power when you're too high was wrong. But nothing about this situation was in his training. Trust her, Chin said. She's been right about everything else. Morrison pushed the throttle forward for engine 1, counting. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. Then he yanked it to idle. The nose dipped down and suddenly they were on a better glide path. Altitude 2,000 feet, runway in sight, Chin called. Airspeed 180 knots. Still too fast, Morrison said. We're gonna hit hard. You're going to hit hard no matter what, Emma said bluntly. Brace for it. But you'll survive. Aim for the touchdown zone markers, don't try to be gentle, just get it on the ground. The aircraft is strong enough to take a rough landing, that's what it's designed for. They crossed the runway threshold at 160 knots, at least 40 knots faster than normal landing speed. Morrison pulled back on the yoke, trying to flare, but with limited control authority, it was more of a controlled crash than a landing. The main gear hit the runway with tremendous force, blowing both tires instantly. The aircraft bounced, came down again on the rims of the wheels, sending sparks flying. Morrison tried to keep it straight using throttle steering while Chen fought to keep the wings level. The nose gear slammed down, its tire also blowing. They were sliding down the runway on wheel rims and the belly of the aircraft, metal screaming against concrete. Shut down engine 1. Emma shouted. Cut all electrical except battery power. Chen hit the engine fire switch and fuel cutoff. Morrison pulled every electrical breaker he could reach. The aircraft continued to slide, slowing but still moving at terrifying speed. The runway was 16,000 feet long, and they used nearly 12,000 of it before the crippled Boeing 737 finally ground to a halt, sitting askew on the runway, emergency slides deploying automatically, foam and emergency crews already racing toward them. For a moment, there was complete silence in the cockpit. Then Morrison let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. We're down. We're alive. We're actually alive. Chen was crying, her hands still gripping the controls with white knuckles. That was impossible. We should all be dead. Morrison turned to look at Emma, this 14-year-old girl who had just saved 147 lives. What's your name, kid? Emma Richardson, she said, and suddenly the adrenaline drained away and she was just a scared teenager again, shaking, tears streaming down her face. Morrison unbuckled and pulled her into a fierce hug. Emma Richardson, you just performed a miracle. The evacuation was swift and professional. Emergency slides deployed, passengers streamed out and away from the aircraft. Miraculously, despite the violent landing, there were only minor injuries, sprains and bruises from the impact. No fatalities. Not one. Emma emerged from the aircraft with Morrison and Chin, and as soon as the passengers realized who she was, that this teenage girl they'd barely noticed had been the one guiding the pilots, the ones who'd saved them, they surrounded her. Some were crying, thanking her. Others couldn't believe it. The businessman from seat 12B stared at her with his mouth open. You were just a kid on her phone, he stammered. I was studying cockpit schematics, Emma said with a tired smile. Research for this exact situation. Karen Martinez hugged her tightly. I'm sorry I called you sweetheart and tried to make you sit down. You didn't know, Emma said. Nobody could have known. The news media descended quickly. The story was too incredible, experienced pilots give up, teenage girl saves everyone. Within hours, Emma's face was on every news channel. Her father, James Richardson, arrived at the airport in tears, pulling his daughter into his arms. I taught you to be ready, he said, his voice choked with emotion. But I never thought you'd actually have to use it. "You saved my life, Dad," Emma said. "You saved all our lives by teaching me." In the days that followed, the investigation revealed the full extent of the aircraft's damage. An uncontained engine failure in the number 2 engine had sent turbine blades through the tail section like shrapnel, severing all 3 hydraulic lines, damaging the auxiliary power units, and causing structural damage to the vertical stabilizer. It was a 1 in 10 million failure cascade, the kind that almost never happened. Captain Morrison and First Officer Chen were initially defensive about needing a teenager's help, but after reviewing what had happened with accident investigators, they came to understand that Emma hadn't just gotten lucky. She had known things they didn't because her education had been unconventional, focused specifically on creative solutions to impossible scenarios. "Standard training teaches you to handle emergencies by the book," Morrison told investigators. Emma was taught to handle emergencies when there is no book. Her father gave her something we don't get in commercial aviation: permission to think beyond the checklist. The FAA launched a review of emergency training protocols for commercial pilots. Emma's techniques, adapted from historical accidents and creative problem-solving, were analyzed and several were incorporated into new training scenarios. Her throttle steering refinements and electrical isolation procedures became teaching cases. Emma returned to her normal life, or as normal as it could be after becoming internationally famous. She finished 8th grade, though she was now recognized everywhere she went. Aviation companies offered her scholarships, pilot training programs, internships for when she turned 18. But the most meaningful recognition came from the 147 passengers of that flight. They organized a reunion 6 months later, and every single person attended. They presented Emma with a plaque that read, "To Emma Richardson, who taught us that wisdom has no age, courage has no limits, and heroes sometimes come in unexpected forms." Standing before them, Emma felt the weight of what she'd done. She'd saved lives not through luck or chance, but through years of preparation that no one had believed would ever matter. Her father had once told her, "Em, you're learning all this not because you'll probably need it, but because you possibly might, and if that moment comes, you'll be ready." That moment had come at 35,000 feet, when both pilots had given up, when death seemed certain, when a 14-year-old girl stood up and refused to let everyone die just because she was young. She had been ready. The story of Flight 2847 became legendary in aviation circles, taught in flight schools, discussed in safety seminars, analyzed by accident investigators. It changed how people thought about emergency training, about unconventional knowledge sources, about the assumptions adults make when they see a teenager. But for Emma, the most important change was personal. She had discovered that all those hours studying disasters, practicing impossible scenarios, absorbing her father's teachings, hadn't been obsession or paranoia. It had been preparation for her life's defining moment. And when that moment arrived, when experienced pilots looked at instruments showing impossible failures and gave up hope, when passengers said prayers and made peace with death, when every rational person believed they were doomed, she had stepped forward with knowledge earned through dedication and used it to save every single life on board. At 14 years old, Emma Richardson had proven that expertise could come from unexpected places, that age was no barrier to capability, and that sometimes the person everyone overlooks is exactly the person everyone needs. The crippled Boeing 737 was eventually repaired and returned to service, with a small plaque installed in the cockpit commemorating the emergency. It read simply, "On this aircraft, experience gave way to knowledge, authority gave way to capability, and assumptions gave way to miracles. Never underestimate the prepared mind." Emma kept a photograph from that day on her desk, showing the damaged aircraft on the runway, emergency slides deployed, passengers evacuating safely. She looked at it every morning, a reminder of what she'd accomplished and what she'd learned about herself. Her father had given her the tools, but she had been the one to use them when it mattered most. She had been the one to stand up when adults sat down. She had been the one to think clearly when panic reigned. She had been the one who refused to accept that impossible meant certain death. At 35,000 feet, both pilots had given up. And a 14-year-old girl had taken over, saved everyone on board, and proved that heroes truly can come from anywhere, even from Seat 12C, where a teenager with earbuds and a phone had been studying cockpit schematics while the world assumed she was just another kid scrolling through social media. Emma Richardson had been ready. And when the impossible moment came, she had shown the world that being young didn't mean being incapable, it meant having a fresh perspective, unconventional knowledge, and the courage to act when everyone else had lost hope. The story ended with everyone alive, every passenger walking away, every life saved. And it began a new conversation about how society trains, teaches, and most importantly, listens to the next generation. Because somewhere out there, another young person might be preparing for their impossible moment, learning skills that seem unnecessary until they become the difference between tragedy and triumph. Emma had proven that when preparation meets opportunity, age doesn't matter. Knowledge matters. Courage matters. And sometimes, the smallest person in the room has the biggest impact. The flight that should have ended in disaster became instead a testament to the power of unconventional education, dedication, and the simple truth that you're never too young to make a difference. You're only too young if you let others convince you that you are. Emma Richardson didn't let anyone convince her. And 147 people went home to their families because she stood up, spoke up, and showed up when it mattered most. 3 years after that fateful day, Emma stood in the lobby of the National Transportation Safety Board headquarters in Washington, D.C. She was 17 now, about to graduate high school with perfect grades and acceptance letters from every major aviation university in the country. But today was special for a different reason. The NTSB was presenting her with the first-ever Youth Aviation Safety Award, recognizing not just her actions on Flight 2847, but her continued contributions to aviation safety. In the years since the incident, Emma had worked with aircraft manufacturers, pilot training programs, and safety boards to develop new emergency protocols based on her experience. Captain Morrison and First Officer Chen were there, both now instructors who taught Emma's techniques to new pilots. "She changed how we think about emergencies," Morrison told the assembled crowd of aviation professionals. "Before Emma, we taught pilots to follow procedures. After Emma, we teach them to understand the aircraft so deeply that they can create procedures when the standard ones fail." The families of Flight 2847 passengers had created a scholarship fund in Emma's name, already sending 3 students to aviation school. The businessman from Seat 12B, whose name was Robert Chin, had become one of the fund's biggest donors. "I judged that girl for being on her phone," he said during his speech. "I thought she was just another distracted teenager. She taught me that you can't judge someone's capability by their age or appearance. Now my own daughter wants to be a pilot because of Emma." Karen Martinez, the flight attendant, had written a book about the experience called The Girl Who Wouldn't Give Up. All proceeds went to aviation safety research. "Emma saved my life," Karen told reporters. "But more than that, she changed my life. She showed me that help can come from anywhere, and we should never dismiss someone just because they're young." Emma's father, James Richardson, sat in the front row with tears in his eyes as he watched his daughter receive the award. After the ceremony, he pulled her aside. "You know what I'm most proud of?" he asked. "What, Dad?" "Not that you saved all those people, though that's incredible," he said. "I'm proud that you had the courage to stand up when everyone thought you were just a kid. You could have stayed quiet, let the adults handle it even if it meant everyone died. But you chose to act. That takes a different kind of bravery." Emma hugged him tightly. "You gave me the knowledge, Dad. But you also gave me the confidence to use it. You always told me that what I was learning mattered even when nobody else believed it." That evening, Emma visited the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, where a special exhibit had been created about Flight 2847. There, behind glass, sat the actual throttle lever from the damaged aircraft, the one First Officer Chen had used to steer the plane on Emma's instructions. Next to it was Emma's phone, still showing the cockpit schematic she'd been studying when disaster struck. A group of school children stood in front of the exhibit, listening to their teacher explain what happened. "This girl was only 14 just like some of you," the teacher said. "But she studied hard, learned everything she could, and when the moment came she was ready. That's the lesson here, you're never too young to learn something important, and you never know when that knowledge might save lives." One little girl raised her hand. Was she scared? Emma stepped forward, unable to resist. "Yes, she was terrified," she said, and the children turned to look at her. The teacher's eyes went wide with recognition. You're her?" the teacher gasped. Emma smiled. "I was so scared I could barely breathe. But my dad taught me something important. Being scared doesn't mean you can't act. It means you're human. Courage isn't about not being afraid, it's about doing what needs to be done even when you're terrified." The children crowded around her, asking questions, wanting to hear the story firsthand. Emma spent the next hour talking to them, answering every question, encouraging them to pursue whatever fascinated them, whether it was aviation, medicine, engineering, or anything else. "The world told me I was too young to matter," Emma told them. "But age is just a number. What matters is what you know, what you can do, and whether you have the courage to step up when you're needed. Don't let anyone tell you you're too young to make a difference." As she left the museum that night, Emma's phone buzzed with a message from Boeing. They wanted her to consult on the design of their next-generation flight control systems, incorporating lessons learned from her emergency. At 17, she was about to become the youngest aviation safety consultant in history. She walked through the Washington streets, thinking about how far she'd come from that scared girl in seat 12C. The world had changed for her, but more importantly, she had changed the world. Airlines now included unconventional emergency thinking in their training. Flight schools taught courses on creative problem-solving in crisis situations. And across the country, young people were pursuing aviation careers, inspired by the teenager who proved that heroes don't always come with gray hair and decades of experience. Sometimes they come with braces, backpacks, and earbuds, studying in the back of the plane, preparing for a moment they hope never comes but will be ready for if it does. Emma Richardson had been that hero. She had stood up when everyone sat down, spoken up when everyone stayed silent, and refused to accept that impossible meant certain. And in doing so, she had not only saved 147 lives but had also inspired millions to believe that they too could make a difference, regardless of their age. The sky above Washington was clear that night, filled with stars and the blinking lights of aircraft arriving and departing. Emma looked up, watching a plane pass overhead, and smiled. Somewhere up there, at 35,000 feet, passengers were safe because pilots were better trained, aircraft were better designed, and the world had learned that expertise could come from unexpected places. All because a 14-year-old girl had refused to stay in her seat when everyone needed her most. The legacy of Flight 2847 would live on in every life saved by the new procedures, every student inspired to pursue aviation, and every person who learned that being young didn't mean being powerless. Emma had proven that preparation, knowledge, and courage could overcome any obstacle, even when experienced professionals had given up hope. And that was a lesson worth more than any award, more than any recognition, more than any fame. It was a lesson that would echo through generations, reminding everyone that the next hero might be sitting right next to you, looking ordinary, seeming unremarkable, but carrying within them the potential to change everything when the moment demands it. Emma Richardson had been ready. The world would never forget it. And countless future heroes would find their courage in her example, knowing that if a 14-year-old girl could save a plane at 35,000 feet, then they too could rise to whatever challenge life presented them. The impossible had become possible. And it all started with a girl who refused to believe that age determined ability, who studied when others played, who prepared when others assumed nothing would go wrong, and who acted when everyone else had given up. That was the real miracle of Flight 2847. Not just that everyone survived, but that one young person showed the entire world what was possible when determination met opportunity, when knowledge met courage, and when someone too young to drive a car became old enough to save the world.